The estate ledger, catalogued under reference number SH11911W, is in most respects an ordinary document. It records the daily expenditure of a private Highland estate across the months of October through February of the 1911-12 season. Coal deliveries, venison yields, wages dispersed to outdoor staff, notes on the condition of the fencing along the southern boundary. It is the sort of record that archivists file and seldom revisit, but 3 pages of that ledger were removed by hand. The cuts are still visible, and the pages that follow them contain entries written in a different hand from the rest, smaller, more deliberate, the pressure of the pen heavier, as though the writer needed to anchor each word to the page before it could escape him. The estate steward who made those entries was a man named Carrick. Whatever he witnessed in the weeks before and after the new year of 1912, he chose to record it in terms that his employer solicitors, upon reviewing the document the following spring, thought sufficiently alarming to warrant a formal notation of their own. That notation, which survives in a separate file, reads in its entirety: "Accounts described herein are consistent with accounts given verbally to this office. We advise no action. We advise no action." 4 words that in the context of what those accounts contain are either a professional understatement of extraordinary discipline or evidence that the solicitors believed on some level that there was nothing to be done. The account assembled here draws on 3 sources: the surviving pages of the Strath Haven estate ledger, a transcribed oral testimony recorded by a parish folklorist named Mrs. Agnes Dunbar in 1923, and a sealed letter written by the Reverend Archibald Moor of the parish of Kinloch, Rannoch, dated the 14th of January of 1912, and not opened until 1967, when the contents of his vestry archive were donated to a regional library. None of these sources are in agreement on every detail. They are in agreement on the essential ones. If you have found your way to this account and have the constitution for what a Highland winter can hold, subscribe to archival terrors. The archive gathers more files than it releases, and this is one of the ones that found its way out. The Moor itself demands some description because it is not a passive backdrop to what occurred. Rannoch Moor occupies roughly 50 square miles of the central Scottish Highlands, a high, flat, largely treeless expanse of peat bog and shallow loch that sits at an elevation sufficient to ensure that winter arrives there before it arrives anywhere else in the region and departs later than welcome. The Caledonian pine forest that once covered much of it had been reduced by the time of these events to isolated remnants. Among them, the stand of timber known locally as the Black Wood, which occupies the western boundary of the Strathaven estate. The trees in that wood are very old. Local tradition of the sort that resists precise attribution holds that they were old when the Norse came, and that the Norse, who were not known for their caution in unfamiliar territory, were cautious in the Blackwood. This is presented not as corroboration of what followed. It is presented as context. The Strath Haven estate in 1911 employed a head gamekeeper and 4 under gamekeepers for the management of the grouse moors and deer ground. The head gamekeeper was Duncan Carrick, who had held the position for 19 years, and who by every surviving account was a man of exceptional professional competence and nearly total imperiousness to sentiment. His employer, Lord Alistair Strath Haven, described him in a letter to a sporting acquaintance as utterly reliable, entirely without imagination, and consequently the best gamekeeper in 3 counties. That last phrase, intended as a compliment, acquires a different quality when read alongside the entries Carrick himself made in that ledger during the winter of 1911 to 12. The first entry of significance is dated the 3rd of November. The day was clear and hard, the first substantial frost of the season having settled overnight. Carrick's notation is brief. Found the fence along the southern boundary of the Blackwood, pulled apart at 2 sections, not cut posts drawn from the ground entire, roots and all disturbed earth frozen around the holes, no tracks, no evidence of livestock or poaching activity. Fence repaired. The phrase "no tracks" is underlined once in isolation. This is nothing. Fences come down. Storms do things that look deliberate. Frost can make a man underestimate how much ground thaw has loosened over a summer. But Carrick underlined the words, and Carrick was not given to emphasis for its own sake. The entry for the 5th of November notes that one of the undergameers, a young man named Alec Tulloch, had reported hearing sounds on the Mall the previous night that he described as not wind and not any animal he could name. Carrick recorded this and noted also that he himself had heard nothing. He wrote that Tulloch was new to the estate that season, having come up from Perth, and that his unfamiliarity with the acoustic properties of an open mand in a hard frost was the most likely explanation. This explanation is entirely reasonable. It is also the kind of explanation that Carrick would reach for and reach for again, and then stop reaching for. The shooting season was finished by the time these events began in earnest, and the estate had settled into its winter configuration. Lord Strathern had departed for his Edinburgh townhouse by the 28th of October, leaving the estate in the charge of Carrick, and the house steward a Mr. Gillies, who appears in the records as the sort of man who kept himself to himself when the option was available. The outdoor staff remained Carrick and 3 of the 4 under gamekeepers. The 4th had taken ill in October and had not returned to his duties. What this meant in practical terms was that when the fence came down again on the 9th of November, not the same sections, but 100 yards further west along the Blackwood boundary, there were 4 men to share the work of investigation and repair, and 4 men to share the growing unease about what the investigation produced. Carrick's entry for the 9th is longer than his usual style would suggest. He notes the second fence breach, the same method as the first posts drawn from the ground rather than broken. The force required, for which he estimates based on his knowledge of the frozen soil conditions, to exceed what any single man could produce without mechanical assistance. He notes that there were this time marks in the frost-dusted ground near the fence line, but that these marks did not conform to any track he could identify. He describes them as deep, irregular impressions, not consistent with hoof forepaw, spaced at intervals, suggesting a stride of approximately 7 ft. 7 ft. The entry moves on immediately. No editorial comment, no expression of alarm. Carrick wrote 7 ft. And proceeded to the next sentence, which concerns the quantity of wire required for the repair. There is something almost more disturbing in that than there would be in a cry of terror. The entry for the 15th of November shifts in character. Carrick had, on the advice of the estate steward, telegraphed Lord Strathern about the fence damage, and had received a reply instructing him to increase the frequency of his patrols along the Blackwood boundary, to document any further breaches, and to establish where the poachers were operating in the area. This was a reasonable interpretation of events. Poachers sometimes work in winter months when professional staff is reduced, and they sometimes dismantle fencing to move deer across a property boundary. Carrick dutifully increased his patrols. On the night of the 13th, Alec Tulloch was assigned the late patrol, the circuit of the southern boundary between 10 in the evening and 2 in the morning. He completed this patrol. He returned to the Bowthorthy at 2:15, and he was by Carrick's description visibly distressed. Carrick's notation reads, Tull reported that he had observed a large animal or object moving at the northern edge of the Blackwood at approximately 4:15. He was unable to provide a satisfactory description. He stated that the shape was too large for any deer or livestock, that it moved without sound, and that it appeared at one point to stop and face him across a distance of approximately 200 yards. 200 YD is the effective range of a rifle in good daylight. In a winter night on an open moor with a lantern that would illuminate perhaps 20 feet in any direction, 200 yards is nothing but darkness. Tulk had seen a shape at 200 yards in the dark with a lantern. He had seen it stop. He had seen it face him, and he had, according to Carrick, remained at his post for the remainder of the patrol, which says something about the young man. Carrick went out at first light on the 14th and inspected the northern edge of the Black Wood. He found in the frozen ground at the Treine the same irregular impressions he had documented at the fence. He also found in the bark of 3 of the outermost pine trees marks that he described as gouges consistent with the action of a large blade or claw set at a height of approximately 9 ft from the ground. He measured this height with a stick held against his own body for scale. He was 5 feet and 10 in tall, a fact that can be established from his surviving military record in the Boer War regimental files. 9 ft. He returned to the estate and submitted a revised report to Lord Strathern by telegram. The telegram does not survive, but Strathern's reply does. It reads, increase patrol. Do not speculate. Investigate systematically. Do not alarm the staff. This instruction, do not alarm the staff, suggests that Lord Strathern had already begun forming a view about what might be responsible for the damage and the tracks, and that this view was not one he wished to share. The entry for the 22nd of November marks the transition into something qualitatively different from unexplained fence damage. On the evening of the 21st, Carrick had assigned the second under gamekeeper, a man named Robert Forbes, to the late patrol. Forbes was 31, a 12-year employee of the estate, and described by Carrick elsewhere in the ledger as thorough and steady. He was also, unlike Tulk, a native of the region. He had grown up in Quinloch Rannoch and had known the estate and its boundaries since childhood. Forbes did not return from his patrol. This fact is recorded in the ledger in 3 words in the entry for the 22nd. Forbes did not return. Beneath this, in what appears to be the same handwriting, but executed with a different pen and considerably more pressure, Carrick has written, search conducted at first light. No sign of Forbes. Blackwood boundary inspected from the outside. No blood, no article of clothing or equipment, no tracks of any familiar kind. The impressions were present again, leading from the wood toward the point on the fence closest to the lock. The fence at that point was down. 2 paragraphs above, in what appears to have been added later, is a single line in brackets. The lock in question has no recorded depth at its northeastern end. Local name, the Black Water. No record of any object ever recovered from it. Forbes was never found. The records of Kinloch Rannoch parish, which documented all deaths and disappearances in the district, contain an entry for Robert Forbes, dated December 1911, noting that he was lost, presumed drowned, circumstances unknown. The word drowned requires a body of water and a body. Forbes provided neither. The account here shifts to Mrs. Agnes Dunbar, the parish folklorist who recorded Carrick's oral testimony in 1923. She notes in her own editorial voice that when she asked Carrick about Forbes directly whether he believed Forbes had drowned, the old man looked at her for a long moment and said only Forbes knew the Moor. He didn't fall into the black water. Carrick had in the days following Forbes' disappearance sent word to Lord Strath Haven requesting either additional staff or permission to reduce the patrol schedule. Strath Haven's response was to travel north himself, arriving at the estate on the 1st of December. His presence is documented in the ledger by a single notation from Carrick. His lordship arrived. I gave my report in full. Whatever Carrick told him, Strathern spent the following 3 days conducting what the ledger describes as personal inspections of the southern and western boundaries. He took no one with him on these inspections. On the 4th of December, Lord Strathern called on the Reverend Archiold Muir at the manse of the parish of Kinloch, Rannoch. What passed between them was not recorded by Carrick, who was not present, but the Reverend Muir's sealed letter, written 6 weeks later, begins with a reference to this meeting. My lord, I write this not to be read by you, for I suspect you will not survive the winter in good health, and I do not write it to be read at all if God is merciful. I write it because what you told me on the 4th of December has confirmed what the oldest accounts of this land have always suggested, and because someone eventually will need to know that confirmation was obtained, and at what cost. The letter is 14 pages. What follows are the sections most directly relevant to the events of November and December 1911. Muir writes that the land on which the Strathern estate stood had been for a period exceeding 300 years prior to the construction of the manor house, the subject of formal avoidance by the farming communities of the surrounding district. He cites records from the Kinloch Rannoch Kirk session dating to 1631, which describe a boundary acknowledged by the local population and not crossed after dark. This boundary, he notes, corresponds precisely to the southern and western fence line of the Black Wood. He writes that the Kirk session records of 1631 were themselves a transcription of older oral traditions, and that the nature of the entity associated with the land was described in those traditions in terms inconsistent with any conventional understanding of an animal. He uses a Scots Gaelic term rendered in the typescript as a base dub, the black beast. He is careful to note that this term was applied not as a colourful description, but as a proper name used consistently across multiple generations of testimony to a specific presence in a specific territory. The entity, as Muir summarizes the tradition, did not leave its territory. It did not pursue those who crossed its boundary and withdrew before the sun rose. What it did not tolerate was encroachment. Prolonged regular human presence at the boundary of its ground, particularly in winter, when the tradition held it moved more freely and with less restraint. The fence along the Blackwood, maintained by generations of Strath Haven gamekeepers conducting their regular patrols, had been doing exactly that for years, and now it was winter, and now the fence was coming down. Muir writes, I told your lordship on the 4th that the only sound counsel I could offer, consistent with my conscience and the evidence of the old records, was that the patrols must cease, and that the fence must not be rebuilt. I told you this was not a counsel of defeat, but of respect for a boundary that is older than the one your family purchased in 1782. I do not believe you accepted this counsel. I hope I am wrong. He was not wrong. The entries in the Strath ledger for December of 1911 are up to the 17th businesslike and sparse. Carrick maintained the patrols now conducted in pairs at Strath Haven's instruction. He recorded the continued presence of the irregular impressions along the western boundary, noted that the replacement fence posts had been disturbed again on the 9th, and noted on the 12th that Alec Tulloch had submitted a written request to be relieved of night patrol duty. Carrick does not record his response to this request. The patrols continued on the same schedule. What happened on the 17th of December is the subject of the longest entry in the ledger, and it is the entry written in that different hand. Smaller, heavier, the letters pressed hard into the page. It covers 3.5 pages and reads less like a gamekeeper's log than like a deposition written by a man who is not certain he will be believed, but intends to be precise regardless. Carrick and Tulloch conducted the evening patrol together, beginning at 8:00. The night was clear, the temperature well below freezing, the moon absent. They reached the western section of the boundary, the section nearest the Blackwood. At approximately 9:15, it was at this point that Tulloch stopped walking. Carrick's account states that the younger man stopped without signal or explanation, and that when Carrick looked at him, his attention was directed entirely toward the tree-line, and his expression was one that Carrick, after 19 years of observing men in difficult conditions, recognized as genuine fear, unmediated by any attempt at concealment. Carrick looked toward the tree-line. He saw nothing moving. He heard nothing. Then he heard it. He describes the sound in the following terms. Not any animal call, I know. A low sound, chest-felt rather than ear-heard, clears throat, with a quality of sustained duration that did not vary in pitch or rhythm. I have heard cattle in distress, stags bellowing, dogs in fear, and men in extremity. And I tell you plainly that this sound belonged to none of those categories. It was not a distress call. It was an address. An address. The word is remarkable in context. Carrick uses it without elaboration, as though no other word would have served. And the restraint of a man who had spent his professional life measuring language against the precise requirements of official report, writing, makes that single word carry more weight than a paragraph of description might have done. The sound continued for, by Carrick's estimate, approximately 4 minutes. Then it ceased, and in the silence that followed something moved in the tree-line. Carrick writes, I saw the shape at a distance of perhaps 100 yards. It was at the edge of the trees, partially obscured by the foremost trunks, and it did not move after the initial movement that had drawn my attention. It stood. He continues, I cannot give you its height precisely because it was standing in shadow, and because the trees behind it are not uniform in their stature, and I had no clean point of comparison. I can tell you that it was above the level of the lower branches of the outermost trees, and that those branches are, as I have measured them in daylight, approximately 11 ft from the ground. He continues, I directed the lantern toward it. This was not wisdom. It did not move when the light reached it. It was facing us. I know this because I could distinguish at that distance in that light the difference between the shape of a thing facing toward and the shape of a thing facing away. Though I could not distinguish any feature, I can tell you that it did not have the outline of any animal I have catalogued in 19 years of this work. The width of the shoulders, if I may call them shoulders, was inconsistent with any known Highland animal. The head, if I may call it a head, sat upon the body in a manner I cannot fully describe without using words that will make this report appear to have been written by a man who has lost his reason. He does not use those words. The gap where they would have been is more effective than any description. Carrick writes that the shape remained at the tree line for what he estimates as between 5 and 8 minutes. The Tarl had not moved or spoken during this entire period. That Carrick had not moved either, and that the lantern had been lowered gradually during this time, not out of strategy, but because his arm had begun to tremble. And he knew. Tess, with the specificity that characterizes the whole entry, that the temperature that night was 14 degrees Fahrenheit, that his hands were adequately gloved, that the trembling was not, in his professional assessment, consistent with the temperature alone. Then the shape moved, not toward them, back into the trees in a single movement that Carrick describes as too rapid for its size. It was there, and then it was not, and the forest was silent and dark and entirely ordinary in appearance. And Carrick and Tull stood on the frozen moor and waited for the period of time that Carrick, writing this later, estimated at 3 minutes, but acknowledged might have been 20, because his sense of time, had, he writes, become unreliable. They returned to the estate. Tull did not speak during the return journey, or, according to Carrick, for the remainder of that evening. The entry concludes, I have not set down what I believe this to be, because I do not know what to call a thing that behaves as this thing behaves, and looks at a distance of 100 yards in lantern light, as this thing looks. I know what a man would call it who had grown up hearing the old names. I am not that man. But I am no longer the man who underlines the words, no tracks, and moves on to the next sentence without comment. Something is in the black wood. It has been there for some time. It has been patient. I believe that patience is becoming something else. Lord Strathern departed the estate on the 21st of December, stating his intention to return in January. He left written instructions with Carrick to maintain the patrols and to inform him immediately of any further incidents. There is no entry in the ledger to suggest that Carrick informed him of what had occurred on the 17th. Whatever the reasons for that silence, they belong to the category of decisions that a man in an impossible position makes when the people who should be making them have chosen to be elsewhere. The entry for the 30th of December is brief and is the last entry written in the standard ledger hand. It reads, Mallister failed to return from the 9:00 patrol. Search conducted. Same result as before. No body, no blood, no tracks. We recognize the fence on the western boundary is down again in 3 places. I have not repaired it. I have not repaired it. After every preceding breach, Carrick had repaired the fence. He repaired it methodically and promptly, as a man of his professional character would, and he noted each repair in the ledger alongside the breach. Now, he had not repaired it, and he had noted the fact that he had not repaired it, and the implication of that notation is that he had decided something. This is the third man. Mallister the third under gamekeeper was 44, married with 2 children in Quinloch Rannoch village. He had worked the estate for 8 years. The parish records describe his disappearance and list its circumstances as unknown. His wife, who outlived him by 31 years, told the folklorist Agnes Dunbar, when interviewed in 1923, that her husband had spoken to her about the Moor in terms she had not taken seriously until he did not come home. She said he had told her the Blackwood was not right that winter, that something had come awake in it, that Carrick was afraid. though Carrick did not say so in so many words, and that if Carrick was afraid, there was something to be afraid of. She said she had told him that the old stories about the bayist were just stories, that men with rifles had nothing to fear from old stories. And she said in the 1923 recording that she had never forgiven herself for that. What happened to the men taken by the Blackwood is not recorded in any of the three sources assembled for this account. The impressions in the frozen ground lead to no recoverable location. The Blackwater Loch, which sits in the shadow of the western boundary, and which has no recorded depth at its northeastern end, yielded nothing to the families of the missing men in the months of searching that followed. It is notable, perhaps, that the searches were conducted only along the eastern and southern edges of the loch. The northeastern end, the end without a recorded depth, was not approached. No reason for this omission appears in any of the records. It may be that the men conducting the searches had their own reasons, and that those reasons were the old ones. In the Reverend Muir's sealed letter, the section that follows his summary of the Kirk session records contains a passage that the regional librarian who first transcribed it marked with a marginal note reading simply disturbing. There is one matter I did not communicate to your lordship on the 4th, in part because I could not claim certainty of it, and in part because I judged it would make no difference to your decision, and I did not wish to add to what you were already carrying. But it belongs in this record, so I set it down. The oldest account in the Kirk session files, an oral testimony transcribed by my predecessor in 1631, attributed to a woman of advanced age who is named only as a cofter of the north boundary, contains a description of the entity that I have read 6 times since our conversation and have not found a way to reconcile with the Christian account of the world's nature that I have spent my life communicating, aiding to this parish. The woman stated that the thing in the black wood was not unknown to those who had lived nearest to it in previous generations. She stated that it had taken from them before, and that it had taken in the same pattern, always in winter, always from the boundary, always in threes, she stated. And here I transcribe the 1631 record as closely as I can render it in current English, that the land feeds and the land does not take more than it needs. And when the feeding is done for the season, it sleeps again, and it does not trouble anyone until the boundary is pressed upon again in the cold months. Muir continues, I do not know how to weigh this account. I am a man of God and a man of some learning, and I find that I cannot dismiss it, and I also find that I cannot accept it without cost to the structure of belief that has sustained me for 50 years of ministry. What I can say with confidence is this. The estate has its 3, and the winter is advanced. And if the 1631 testimony is to be credited, the boundary will now be left in peace until someone builds the fence again and sets men to walking it in the dark months. He closes the letter with a prayer. It is a private prayer, not a formal one, written in the first person, and it asks, among other things, that the land be allowed to keep what it has taken without further claim on those who still live. It is in its way the prayer of a man who has given up asking for the other outcome. The letter was sealed that same day and placed among his vestry papers, where it remained for 55 years. Lord Strath Haven did not return to the estate in January. His Edinburgh physician advised him to remain in the city on account of a cardiac complaint that had developed that autumn. He sold the estate in 1913 to a sporting syndicate from London who had no knowledge of the events of 1911 to 12. The syndicate, employed new staff. The fence along the Blackwood boundary was rebuilt. Patrols were resumed. Whether what followed during the winter of 1913 was recorded by anyone is not known. The syndicate's records do not appear to have survived. What is known is that by 1915, the estate had changed hands again and was not operated as a sporting estate for several years thereafter. The Blackwood remained standing. It still stands. Duncan Carrick left the Strathaven estate in January of 1912. Agnes Dunbar's 1923 interview finds him living in a small house in Crieff, retired from gamekeeper work, tending a garden that his neighbours described as exceptionally well maintained. He was 61 at the time of the interview, and Dunbar describes him as physically vigorous, but quieter than his reputation suggested he would be, and with a habit of pausing before he answered any question that touched on Strath Haven. He answered Dunbar's questions fully and precisely without embellishment and without evasion for 3 hours. At the end of the interview, when Dunbar asked whether he had ever returned to Rannoch Moor, he said that he had not and that he would not. She asked whether he was afraid to. He thought about this for what she records as a considerable time, and then said, "No, I am not afraid to go back. Snorts, I understand what is there. I am afraid for anyone who goes back without understanding what is there, and I am afraid that understanding it would not save them in any case." He told Dunbar one thing at the end of the interview that did not appear in any of the written records. He told her that on the night of the 17th of December, when the shape had stood at the treine and faced them across the frozen moor, he had directed the lantern toward it, and that in the moment before the trembling of his arm made the light too unsteady to be useful, he had seen the shape's face, or what served it as a face. He had not described this in the ledger. He had not described it to Lord Strath Haven. He had not in the 12 years between that night and this interview described it to anyone. He described it to Agnes Dunbar. The description she recorded in her folklorist's notebook in careful shorthand is preserved in the regional archive alongside the typescript of Muir's letter and the photographic reproduction of the relevant ledger pages. This writer has read it. What Carrick described in that farmhouse garden in Crieff in the quiet afternoon light, in a voice that Dunbar notes did not waver, is not something that admits of easy transcription into language intended for a general account. It is the kind of description that a man gives once in a place he feels safe to a listener he has decided to trust. What can be said is that it was not the face of a beast in the way that word is usually employed. Wah! Whatever moved at the edge of the Blackwood on that December night was not operating from hunger alone or from territorial instinct alone. There was in Carrick's description of its regard, the way it held itself in the dark, the stillness, the duration of its attention, something that he could only compare to deliberation, not the reflexive stillness of an animal caught in unfamiliar light. Something that considered, something that assessed what it was looking at and applied to the assessment a quality that was not, in its outward expression, distinguishable from patience, except that it was not the patience of waiting. It was the patience of having already decided that waiting was unnecessary. It had looked at them. It had decided, and it had turned back into the dark. Carrick told Dunbar that he had thought about this many times in the years since, about the moment of decision, about what it implied, that it was capable of restraint, that it chose to exercise it, that something in its reckoning of that night had resolved in their favour. He said he did not know what they had done or failed to do that had led to that resolution. He said he was grateful for it, in the way a man is grateful for something he cannot explain and does not deserve. He said he was not grateful enough to go back and test whether it would decide the same way twice. What Dunbar writes at the bottom of that final notebook page after her transcription of Carrick's description is a single line in her own editorial voice. It reads, "He does not know why it let him go. He has lived 11 years with that not knowing, and it appears to have shaped him in the way that prolonged cold shapes certain kinds of stone, not by breaking it, but by making it harder and more still." The estate records of Strathaven House are held in their surviving form in a regional archive in Perth. The ledger with the missing pages and the different handed entries is listed in the finding aid as miscellaneous estate papers condition incomplete. It is not flagged as being of particular historical interest. It sits in a box with other Edwardian administrative records from the same district, most of which concern grouse yields and coal deliveries, and the wages of men whose names are otherwise unrecorded. The sealed letter of the Reverend Archibald Moor is held in the same archive in a different collection. The two documents are not cross-referenced in the finding aid. No researcher prior to the preparation of this account appears to have consulted them together. The Blackwood still stands on what was once the western boundary of the Strathaven estate, though the estate itself has long since been broken up and parcelled into smaller holdings. The fence along the wood's southern boundary, rebuilt and maintained by various owners across the past century, comes down every few winters. Local farmers who work their land near it sometimes report finding the posts pulled from the ground, roots intact. They attribute this to weather or to vandalism or to deer pressing against the wire in the rut. These are reasonable explanations. They are the explanations that Carrick reached for in the beginning. The Black Water has no recorded depth at its northeastern end, and the mow is patient. What accounts like this one preserve is not a record of the world as it ought to be, but of the world as it was encountered by people who had no framework for what they found, and who recorded it anyway. In ledgers and letters, and the careful notebooks of patient listeners, because they understood that the record mattered even when no one was ready to believe it. The documents assembled here did not ask to be found. They waited in their boxes in their separate collections, uncross-referenced and unread for the better part of a century. That is in its own way a kind of patience. If this account has reached you, consider what others may remain unfiled. There are more territories marked on maps that no longer show the markings, more boundary accounts from more cold winters, more entries from men of steady constitution who underlined certain words and moved on and then stopped moving on. Subscribe to archival terrors. The archive does not close. Leave your account in the record below. Some of you will recognize the details of this testimony from other sources, other regions, other fence lines that keep coming down. We read every dispatch.